Morning, I'm KC. This is Keystone Curiosity, where we talk about all things unique to the state of Pennsylvania. Today's episode is going to be about Fort Necessity National Battlefield. Welcome to Keystone Curiosity, where we explore the life, land, and culture of my beloved home state. Pennsylvania has something to offer everyone, and is living proof that the world is a beautiful place. You just need to take the time to find it. Located less than 12 miles east of Uniontown, Fort Necessity was once the site that saw the first and only surrender of George Washington. Quick shout out to Connor Olaf for suggesting today's episode of Fort Necessity. There are a lot of really cool places all across Pennsylvania, and it's comments like these that help to enlighten me of places that I might not ever have heard of otherwise. So to all of you out there who leave suggestions in the comments, thank you. In the early 1700s, both France and Britain would be busy solidifying and expanding their land claims in the North American continent. This would see the two world powers come into conflict in the Pennsylvania frontier, as both had laid claim to the land in the Ohio Valley. This would eventually turn into violence on May 28, 1754, when a young Virginia militia officer by the name of George Washington encountered a band of Frenchmen in a ravine that would later become known as Jumonville Glen. Now, I've already made a video outlining the details of that particular event, which I recommend you watch, but in short, shots were fired, leaving the bodies of one Virginian and 12 Frenchmen across the wooded ground. The officer in command of the French party, Joseph Coulon de Villers de Jumonville, was among the fallen. His death in particular would become the cause of outrage. The report the French had received of his execution after the cessation of fighting had led to the commander of nearby Fort Duquesne to begin assembling troops to seek retribution. Though only 22 at the time, Washington knew the French would not sit idle for long. He returned to Great Meadows and began construction of a small fortification that he had dubbed Fort Necessity. When Washington arrived at Great Meadows, he found a charming place for an encampment, keeping in mind that he was here to build a road, not a fort. Because of this, Fort Necessity was rather small and unassuming by the standards of what we consider a fort to be today. Like most other frontier forts at the time, it was mainly a log cabin roughly 14 by 14 in size that was used as a stockhouse to keep powder and important supplies dry. Around the stockhouse was built a simple palisade wall, with the majority of the fort's defenses lying in the creek beds that ran through the meadow. These provided a natural trench for Washington's men, and he had supplemented them by piling earth to further protect his position. They would finish their work on June 3rd. Meanwhile, at Fort Duquesne, around 600 French Canadians had been amassed, along with about 100 native warriors. Command of this unit would be placed in the hands of Louis Coulon de Villers, the half-brother of the murdered Jumonville. They would embark from the fort on June 28, just 1 month after the ambush had occurred. After finishing construction, Washington and his troops would return to their original orders, building a road towards Fort Duquesne to allow the British a supply and attack route should the need arise. During this time, he would receive reinforcements with supplies and 9 swivel guns, bringing his total force to just under 400 officers and men. Scouts would report a large French force advancing in their direction, which saw Washington gathering his troops together back at Fort Necessity on July 1st. The next day, they further prepared their defenses, digging the trenches deeper and adding to the earthworks. In the early morning hours of July 3rd, Coulon and his unit would come upon Jumonville Glen. The scalped and bloated corpses of their countrymen would cause them to pause just long enough to give them a proper burial, before they continued on towards Fort Necessity. At 11 a.m., they would reach Great Meadows. Washington, who had been trained in the typical European style of warfare, formed some of his men into battle lines and advanced across the open field to confront the vanguard of the enemy column. But the French showed no interest in engaging the Virginians in this manner, as they had noticed something that Washington did not. He had placed his defenses less than 100 yards away from the tree line, well within the effective limits of a musket at the time. The French and their native allies saw this and used it to their advantage. Coulon and his troops took up positions in the woods, and hundreds of muskets began peppering the exposed redcoats, forcing them to retreat to their fortifications. And then the rain started. This caused 2 significant problems for Washington and his men. The first was that keeping the gunpowder dry had been next to impossible, leading most of their guns to misfire. The second was that the trenches they had prepared utilized the creek beds in the field, which now returned to their water-filled ditches nature had intended, making Washington's defenses a sloppy, muddy mess, further dampening the morale. The French had surrounded the fort, keeping up a constant fire on the overcrowded defenders, inflicting heavy casualties, whilst being able to use the trees for cover and minimize their own. The fighting would last until around 8 p.m., when Coulon, whose men were tired from the march in and running low on ammunition, called a ceasefire to discuss the terms of Washington's surrender. With over a quarter of his men either dead or wounded, and no help likely to arrive, Washington would be forced to accept. These terms would be the final mistake that Washington would make that day. With naught but candlelight and rain-soaked paper, his translator had difficulty reading the specific wording of the terms, which were written in French. These terms allowed Washington and his men to return to Virginia with their colors, but it also placed sole blame and responsibility for the assassination of Joseph Coulon de Villers de Jumonville on Lieutenant Colonel George Washington, which his translator misunderstood. The French would burn Fort Necessity to the ground before returning to Fort Duquesne with a document of Washington's surrender. This document, with its wording, would be used as propaganda to spark outrage in Paris and drum up support for the coming war effort all across France. The events that occurred here in western Pennsylvania are regarded as the start of the French and Indian War, which would escalate to a global conflict as Britain officially declared war in 1756. This saw fighting on 5 continents and the seas from the Caribbean to the Pacific. The 7 Years' War, as it is called in Europe, would end in 1763, with France turning over the vast majority of their North American land claims to Britain. But war is expensive, even if you are the victor, which saw England imposing taxes on their colonies in America to recuperate some of the costs. This would be the start of a story that everyone should be familiar with, as 13 ragtag colonies took on the most powerful empire in the world, winning their independence with the help of a familiar name who had learned a few lessons from his mistakes on the Pennsylvania frontier. Today, Fort Necessity stands as part of the National Park Service and is designated as one of the 11 national battlefields across the U.S. First developed in 1932, the battlefield is preserved on around 900 acres, including the site of Jumonville Glen. Located right off of Route 40, the battlefield sports a replica of the fort and a visitor center that educates guests on the history of the grounds. Artifacts and immersive displays are used to tell the story of the fort, as a visitor center walks guests through an outline of the effects of those days and how they eventually led to the world that we know today. With trails that provide easy access and a themed playground, there is more than enough for every member of the family to enjoy their time here, regardless of one's particular interest in history. After years of archaeological research, the fort is reproduced as closely as possible to Washington's original design back in 1754. Now it stands as the centerpiece of the park and is used in conjunction with reenactments and weapons demonstrations, bringing history to life in a way not easily forgotten. The mistakes that were committed by George Washington here would have perhaps the most profound ripple effect that one day leads to the formation of the United States. And with free admission all year round and field trip opportunities for local educators, it has never been easier to learn the vital lessons of how one man's mistakes can one day lead to something far greater than himself. That's going to wrap it up for today's episode. Thank you guys so much for watching. As per the usual, if you have any suggestions of where you'd like to see me go next, feel free to leave them in the comments below. In the meantime, hit that like and subscribe so that you can receive notifications about anything else near Fort Necessity or all across the state of Pennsylvania itself. In the meantime, y'all have a good one.